I'm a volunteer at a homeless hostel, and I'm part of a church team that goes into a homeless hostel one night a week, and it's part of our church commitment to young homeless people. And we had a situation about a year ago where there was a young lad called Sean who was a member that we knew really well. In fact, we've known him over about 10 years from the time that he was in the hostel. We developed a good rapport with him. And unlike some of the people that come, he was actually very articulate, very warm, very friendly. And over a number of years, we developed a very good relationship with him. An interesting sign, he'd always ask about, what we've been doing during the week. He had a real interest in us. And he was a kind of cheerful person to be around. And he was there for a number of years and then moved on to, he's resettled once he left the hostel into a neighbouring town. But because of the relationship, we sort of continued to meet, and we often did activities for the hostel at sort of golf driving ranges or canoeing, and Sean would come along and join us, and we felt very at ease with him, and vice versa. But there came a time where we just noticed that he seemed to be becoming a lot more affluent. He had various nice sports cars. He was quite showy about them. He talked a lot about expensive presents he'd bought friends. And when we gently challenged him, he said, it was part of his inheritance. He'd inherited a lot of money, and this was how he was spending it. And so we sort of, didn't really take much notice of it, but just thought, well, this is just typical Sean. This is how he lives life, and he's not really. We tried to think about getting to buy his own flat or do something kind of to put the money in a good way. And then there was one particular incident where we, as usual, took the residents of the hostel out to an activity. It happened to be bowling. He said, could he come along? And so he joined us. And it was a good evening. He engaged with the residents. It felt fine. It was only later that week, when we'd been to the bowling alley, that the manager of the hostels phoned us and said they discovered drugs on one of the most vulnerable people in the hostel, and it transpired that Sean had supplied him with the drugs. So there was a bit of a safeguarding investigation, and I was involved in challenging him about the supplying of drugs, and it became a very difficult conversation. He denied it was him. He said it was passed on, but more and more evidence came to light that he was probably part of a County Lions network. The more we challenged it, the more aggressive he became. But it also transpired that he had just been accepted for a job in a special school as an assistant. It was a school that dealt with children who'd been excluded from school, and he had now got this job. So we felt, from a safeguarding point of view and from the hospital's point of view, we needed to inform the school that this incident had taken place. When we told him this, he became even more aggressive and threatening, and particularly threatening languages towards the young person who he'd supplied the drugs to. As it happened, nothing transpired. The police were involved, but they dropped the charges. It was a bit unclear why. But there was a consequence to all this. As a team, I think we felt we'd been taken for a ride. We put a lot of trust in this person, and it led to some consequences that we couldn't go back to the hostel for a while until they completed their safeguarding procedures. And then any future events, we were involved in the hostel, we had to have an additional staff member from the hostel with us. So there was a kind of loss of confidence, and I think as a team, a sort of slight sense that we've been sort of a bit naive really about this situation. So I think some learning from the story. Well, what is that? I think we, as I've said, we were a bit naive about, we didn't spot the signs early on, the changing cars. He progressed to a bigger Mercedes, which was very flashy. That was an obvious sign. Some of the aspects around his expenditure, etc. So I think, we were very naive to that. And I think also blending him as an old resident with new residents was a huge mistake. So I think, we've learned a lot from the situation. And I guess at the end of it, you're left with a feeling, how do you build trust? How do you build rapport with vulnerable people and yet at the same time not be taken for a ride, be aware of the safeguarding issues. How do you hold that balance? What's the cost of being supportive and engaging, yet you could find yourself in a difficult situation as we found? So lots to learn and lots to reflect on.